Everybody. This is Bart Sharp of Becoming Quantum Conscious on United Public Radio Network and UFO Paranormal Radio Network on 107.7 and 105.3 out of the beautiful city of New Orleans, Louisiana. And due to the beauty of the internet, I'm in Austin, and my guest Perdita Finn is in the Catskill Mountains of New York. So we're all over the place, and of course, United Public Radio Network is all around the world. It's not only on radio, internet, but also on Roku, Facebook, YouTube, and all of these places all around the world. And of course, if you are on YouTube or one of these places that has chats, you can join into the chat and ask Perdita very probing questions or make comments. We love that. And so, with that said, I have the author Perdita Finn, author of this very lovely book, Take Back, oh boy, this is hard to do, Take Back the Magic. I wanted to show this close up because it's such a mysterious book cover. You're almost like you have the beauty of the forest in a black background that takes you into, we're going on a mysterious journey with this book, and mysterious it is. So thank you so much, Perdita, for being on this show today.
Thank you, Bart, for having me on. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, it's such a lovely book. Not only is the information good, and it's just gives a very in-depth journey about your own personal journey and your personal growth and the struggles and the challenges, and of course the magic of finding out how you can take that magic back. And it's really that, and you know, the most attractive thing about it is how eloquently it's written.
Thanks a lot.
I mean some of those books, like, and probably, you know, those of you on the chat, you may want to just say, yeah, Bart, you're right on with this comment. I love to hear that. And I'm sure Perdita would too. But page 1, I'm reading this book, and some books, by the first page, you're already pulled in, and you're just saying to yourself, this is going to be a beautiful ride. I'm going to read it slowly because I want to get it all in.
Thank you.
It is eloquently written.
Thank you so much. That means a great deal to me. You know, I owe many writers for training me as a writer. Most of all, my husband is a wonderful poet, you know, with whom we have a lot of fun writing poetry together. I was also trained for years. I paid the bills by writing children's books, My Little Pony books. Some of your readers may know. And when you write for children, when you write for 10-year-olds, you learn that you have to engage them. And I always say, better than any creative writing program was having to keep 10-year-olds turning the pages. They taught me so much about writing. And they taught me so much about magic, actually, children. So I was very grateful for those years. I'm grateful I don't have to write them anymore, but I'm also for those listeners who grew up on them, I was behind the scenes.
Yeah, could you just share a little bit about that comment about they taught me about magic?
Well, you know, it's so interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this. I grew up in an atheist family, you know, a really 1960s post-war, you know, rah-rah capitalism family, right? You know, and my father was pretty aggressive about it. He, you know, he would not let my grandmother take us to church, and we didn't see her very often. There were no religious iconography in the house. And so I really grew up with a tremendous ignorance about religion. And with curiosity about it, of course, ignited by that. But my mother, who was disinterested in all matters spiritually, with a radical disinterest, nevertheless raised us on the British children's books she'd been raised on. A writer particularly called Edith Nesbit, from the late 1800s and early 1900s in England. And Nesbit kind of invented the children's literature we know today that would give birth to C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien and J.K. Rowling and all these other fantasy writers. And she was a feminist. She was a socialist. She wasn't interested in religion, but she believed in magic. And
Wow.
and I grew up on these books where animals talked, where the plants came to life, where stones might turn out to take you on time traveling adventures. And they actually, strangely, introduced me to a kind of animistic mindset that got in on the ground floor of my being. So I'm
Mm.
very indebted to her, very indebted to her writings.
Wow. Wow. It's such a, I think we could talk about your father for the whole show, but I don't want to do that.
You can. He'd love it. He'd love you, Bart.
Yeah, he'd be like, he's tuning in. I'm sure he is.
He wants you to interview him, and I'll just get out of the way.
Yeah, there we go. But you have a part in the book where you share that you remember him waking you up and bringing you down for cereal after he had a late night at the hospital. But as you recall those memories at a deeper way later in the book, you're not asleep. You are in some sort of alternative state of being, praying to Mother Mary.
Yeah. So here's the
And
thing. In this totally non-religious family, in this family with no spiritual or religious language, when I was a very small child, my father would, at midnight, or what we'd call it frosted flakes at midnight. And I was a very small child, 3 or 4, and we would go down together, and it was magic, me and my dad, and we'd have big bowls of cereal, and big spoons. And he'd tell me these fabulous stories about polar bears and, pirates and buried treasure. And it was wonderful. But it wasn't until the year before he died that he told me the backstory. And the backstory is he would come home from the hospital, and he was a surgeon in a small rural country hospital, which meant that the people he'd been putting back together again were, the wife of his best friend who'd been killed in an automobile accident, or the child of another friend who'd thrown themselves off a bridge. So he was in a state of tremendous anguish. And he would come home, and he told me that I would be awake, and I was on my knees praying in front of a statue of the Virgin Mary I had found and would keep hidden. And he had no idea where I'd found the statue. And he had no idea how I'd learned about prayer. And he wanted to distract me from this religious impulse.
wow. And it really, the way you wrote it, it's almost like you weren't for sure how that came out of you either.
I think I came into this life with devotion, right? I came in with this. And one of the things, Bart, I love to do and think about a lot, we all come into this life with a lot of baggage. Some of it's checked and some of it's overhead, right? We all have a lot of experiences from past lives. And I know you know this.
Yes.
And it's wonderful if our parents are attuned to that, and they can help us access those stories, gifts, predilections, prayers we're in the middle of, right? And help us cultivate it. Like, it would have been wonderful to have a father who was curious and said, "What are you doing? Can I join you?" You know what I mean? Like, maybe I would have written, I wrote a book, The Way of the Rose, The Radical Path of the Divine Feminine Hidden in the
Yes.
Rosary, which I must assure you is not a Catholic book, but it is about devotion.
It is. And it's such a fabulous book.
But it took me 40 years to recover my devotion. And,
wow.
Here's my prayer for my next life. I want my parents to know who I am And I don't mean like to say, oh, Perdita likes words and storytelling. No, I want them to look at me and go, oh, it's Perdita. We know Perdita.
You come back with that theme a little bit in subtle ways in the book because you say, well, when have I ever had a lifetime where Clark and I just get to relax and do nothing and enjoy each other? Which says on the other side, I've had many lifetimes where I've been on very extreme missions.
You
And
have, Bart.
and you seem to be on that same path this lifetime and trying to sew something together so other people can have better lives. And that's what Take Back the Magic is, I think, trying to teach the reader. How can you have a better life?
Yeah. And how can we access our wisdom? You know, we live in such
Yes.
an information age, right? There's information everywhere at the touch of our fingertips,
Hmm.
but we've lost track of how to access wisdom. And wisdom doesn't come from the top down, it comes from the bottom up. It comes
That's
from
right.
those soul stories we have. And sometimes people will say about a baby, oh, that's an old soul. And I go, every soul is old, but some souls remember they're old and some
Uh-huh.
don't. But we can all remember it.
Indeed.
We can all remember.
Indeed. It's amazing how people under 30, I meet so many special people that they're doing phenomenal things, and these memories are coming up because there's less of a veil. But for us
Wow,
who
yeah.
are over 30, I'm not telling my age. I'm not asking you to tell yours.
Oh, I'll tell mine.
However, oh, it's okay. I think the mystery is really good. Um, we're on this kind of courageous journey to find that. And I think there's something really admirable about that. And that's probably what Take Back the Magic is about. You have found a source by talking to your ancestors, the dead in general, that's given you a lot of these insights.
Yeah, they've really and sometimes, when I didn't know what was happening, it can feel frightening. The other side can feel frightening when we're not in conversation with it. You know, I tell the story about being 19 years old and finding myself having panic attacks in the southwest of France and not having any idea why. I'm taking a Eurail pass with a buddy and hoping to meet some cute boys. And the next thing I know, I'm in a state of existential panic and fleeing my friend, fleeing this land I'm in, trying to escape. I'm completely unaware of what's going on. And it's like, my long story was coming up from inside of me and grabbing hold and saying, we've got some stories to tell you about who you are. Are you ready?
Uh-huh. Indeed. And so much about the Cathar tragedies sounded like it came up in your
Yeah.
memory. Maybe like you were one of them that had the most unfortunate things happen to them.
As a child, my own sense of it is not that I was, anyone important, but I think I found myself near Beziers. And as a child, I often had, until this experience, memories of running away from people. And, many of the peasants ran away when the Cathars were massacred on July 22nd in Beziers into the surrounding foothills.
And it's in case people do not know the history of this, is that the Cathars were a group of followers of Jesus and practices of Mary Magdalene, most likely,
Yeah.
that were a bit different than the Roman Catholic Church. And that's another story. However, the town of Beziers was genocide, and we're talking probably 40,000 people, something like that.
Hitler and Himmler studied the church's techniques with the Cathars,
Yeah,
just to give you some idea of how effective it was.
yes, it was the first major genocide in the world. And that was a huge trauma point because it was one of the first cities to ever have this happen. It was quite, I don't know if they were surprised, but uh, it probably wasn't in anybody's realm of possibilities. Although,
That's a way of describing it. And I think I think one of the things that's so interesting about the Cathars is they believed in reincarnation. They believed in the long story of the soul. And that's so challenging to the church because they believed in the perpetual reincarnation of Mary Magdalene and Jesus, right? And so the
Yes.
church then couldn't control the story. They couldn't control, if Jesus is not here and might come back, the priestly authorities get to control the story. And they hadn't figured out how to game it the way the Tibetans do, and say, "Well, we're going to get the Dalai Lama this time." But it's reincarnation upsets that kind of lineage of power, and so
It
that's why
does.
it's such a threatening. It's a really radical. It radically upsets the apple cart, and that's what I love about it. I always say, I'll meet people who say like, "Oh, I don't have to worry about climate change. I'm going to age out." I say, "But we're
Right.
going to all be reborn to this world,
Yes.
and what's
And
that
and
world going to look like?"
and also just the karmic uh, responsibility that you take care of a planet and you take care of others in times when such stress is there. Uh, I think that that's a really important part about that. And I just want to tell the audience, it's like if you have questions for Perdita, please send them on to us and or just say hi. We are on United Public Radio Network and UFO Paranormal Network on Roku and YouTube, Facebook, and other platforms. And so much about, I guess, your passion with this. It sounds like you're passionate about a lot of stuff.
I am.
However, the work with the dead is something that you're very passionate about. I've not met anybody with that intensity.
Well, here's the thing, and I tell the story of how I came to this work, which was entirely privately and, very intimately. And, it was an odd little thing. My teachers were the dead themselves,
Hmm.
and they guided me and they showed me, and it's very simple. It's that the dead are real. And I talk about the dead. I don't talk about ancestral lineages. And the reason I don't talk about lineages is lineages aren't really real. We don't have lineages. We have root systems. And root systems tend to be entangled and they go like mycelial networks underground in all directions at once.
Hmm.
They've got 10 dimensions they're working in. And if anyone's ever actually followed their ancestry, you get lost quickly. You start following one mother and then you end up with a sister and then a cousin. And the next thing you know, it's getting very complicated. And if you go back 7 generations, you've got 200 grandparents. Things get messy. And then add in lovers and friends and pets and neighbors and teachers. And I work with all the dead. And what I want to say is that all the dead, everyone, every soul that has ever been is there for us still, ready to guide us, help us, and collaborate with us in coming into the fullness of our lives.
Hmm.
And I mean, the book I've written is an intimate look at how I healed with a father who was very difficult in life. Not simply bad, because in some ways that would have been easier, right? But
Yeah.
like so many real people, lovable and terrible simultaneously.
And, and
And
it and it sounds like you two really loved each other.
oh,
And at the same time, he was a real pickle.
I was going to say he was the son of a bitch, Bart, but that's
Well, this is the radio.
so I'm sorry.
No, that word's okay. But anyway, yeah, yeah. And somehow through this process, you have changed your relationship with him.
I have, and this story is about the gifts he sent to me after he died. And he sent me a lot of gifts after he died. In fact, the basic premise of the book is it begins when I found out he cut me out of his will. And
Oh, yes.
and it's really hard to cut someone out of your will. It's really hard to cut your children out of your will. And to do it, you need pretty aggressive language. So it's kind of horrifying to read. And
This is page 1 in her book, by the way.
not only that, he sent me a rock, but I'm not even going to go into that. But since then, my father has given me an inheritance that is so generous and so profound, it's become laughable in my family. All I have to do is ask my father for something, and it shows up. And so much so that my husband and I and my kids laugh that if I'd actually inherited something from his will, I might not have made out so well financially. He was waiting for the other side. And
Yeah.
no spoilers. I'm not giving spoilers away, but there are many.
Thank you, Jane Clark.
Bart and I were talking before about, not getting stuck in resentment. And one of the things I've discovered about the dead is that our relationships with them are ongoing. They're relationships, they're alive. And so I think when a lot of people die, most people die, what they discover on the other side is that long story. They rediscover and integrate.
So when you say long story, you're talking about lifetimes with this person.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, and they have, what the dead have is perspective. They have that deep time perspective. And for some people, that means when they die, they go, oh boy, did I screw up. Oh boy. And for some of us, I hope I try to see with the eyes of the dead while I'm still alive. I want to experience the reunion. I want to honor all of the mystery and entanglement while I'm still alive. But sometimes I say that, I think when my father died, he saw a lot of his mistakes and he was ready to make up for them. And so all of the things that had gotten in the way of him being a loving person alive had vanished when he died. But it took, healing as a process. And I often say, I did not forgive my father. My father atoned for his mistakes, and forgiveness became inevitable.
Wow. So does he appear like a voice in your life now?
Well, I'm not a psychic, Bart. I don't hear or see the dead.
I know this. I know this is the funny thing about you. You're very intellectual, and through this book, I don't want to give away too much.
I have friends who see the dead. Like one of my dearest friends, she can hardly tell the living and the dead apart. Like we'll go somewhere and she'll say to me, "How many people are in the room, Perdita?" Just because she wants to figure out who's alive and who's dead. I'm not like that.
Yeah, but it comes to you in a subtle way, obviously, because
all of us, we're all psychic, and it all comes to some of us, great novelists or poets, they're channeling the experiences of the dead, right? W.B. Yeats was my father's favorite poet. He actively channeled with his wife,
wow.
And I think, novelists are frequently psychic, frequently tapping in. They're just calling it novel writing. Musicians are tapping in, artists are tapping in, and some people are tapping in as healers, right? Look, I don't know if you ever read the work of Stephen Buhner, the extraordinary herbalist. He was experiencing his psychism through his communication with the plants.
Yes. Yes.
I think we all have psychic gifts, but we don't all have the same psychic gifts.
Indeed. That's the beauty of the human experience.
Right.
I loved your description that the connection with the dead is like the mycelium network. And by the way, next week I want to give a little promo. Neil Doomra and Stephen Huntsman are going to be on, and and the topic will be the mycelium revolution. And one of the things that Stephen points out to me is um, every square inch of the planet has 100 miles of mycelium network running through it. And when we talk about the dead, we're talking about accessing multitudes of information experiences and such on the other side. It's like a mycelium network that has millions of little root systems going out and connecting.
I mean, one of the most spiritual books I've read in the past few years is Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, who's a mycologist, but also the son of Rupert Sheldrake, who's thought about consciousness in such interesting ways, right? But, you know, one of the things he says is, you know, when mycelium spread out, and mushrooms are just the fruiting bodies of these networks, you know, which are like these great root systems, but they're going in every direction at once. They don't just go forward, they're going 360 degrees.
Yes.
And the dead are like that. And so the dead are actually the connectors, the weavers. We know this, you know, in the old stories, the great mother goddesses are often weavers,
Yes.
often spinners. Sometimes they're even spiders, you know, and the web is that image. We talk about the veil, but the veil itself is the diamond net of Indra. It's that fabric of existence. It's made up of all of our souls woven together and shimmering kind of all around us.
That's beautiful. That's the type of images you write so eloquently in your book. You know, it's like looking at a wonderful painting with words. Yeah, it just goes. When you're talking about the dead, we're talking about a multi-dimensional reality that
we see like this much, right? We see a little tiny bit. And the reason I like to work with the dead and collaborate with them is because they see a lot more than I do. I like to let them be in the driver's seat. You know, I figure they've got a better access to a better set of maps than I do.
Oh, wow. That takes some humility.
Well, maybe it takes hitting my head against the wall enough times in my own life. How we get to humility is often not fun.
Very, very good point. Good point. Yeah, I've been playing with these concepts, and I had a grandfather who was highly abusive, like really, really. He was really brutal, and I keep asking him to help me with things that are rough and tough, because he's a tough guy. I don't agree with this point of view, but there has to be some strength in there.
Well, you know, when we have these monsters in our family history, and to be a civilized human being we all have monsters because civilization turns us into monsters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it cultivates our monstrousness to each other. And I think when we die, we get to finally see our mistakes. Mm. But how do we work with the difficult dead? I mean, my book is about how I worked with my father, and it wasn't immediate. I didn't just forgive him. I just didn't say, oh, now you're dead and everything's fine. Trust takes time. And I think one of the things is the dead are dead and they can handle our rage. And we're allowed to be angry at them, really angry. And we're allowed, you know, my husband's stepfather died last year at 91, and he'd been a pretty tough guy, abusive to him, and physically abusive, and they'd made their peace by the time he passed, sort of. And then he died, and it finally, for the first time for my husband, was safe to feel angry at him.
Wow.
And he said, I don't want his picture on my altar. I don't want to talk to him. I'm done with that guy. Finally,
Yeah.
it's a long time.
Woo.
And then a year after he died, he said, I'm going to give him a job. And he gave him a real crappy, go muck out the barnyard kind of job. And his dad did it.
Wow.
And he got his photo on the altar. And, sometimes you don't have to start with the worst ancestors, but, like your abusive grandfather, make him work for it. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's okay to make those guys, I mean, like you said, often their rage, patriarchy doesn't even work for the patriarchs, right? Often their rage and their violence is a result of their fears and their terrors and all these things. And I'm sure that didn't make them very happy. And they now on the other side, they do want to make amends, right? But they have to make amends.
Indeed. I wanted to share a story about my own father who died about 10 years ago. He never really liked me a lot. He had two older sons that were his boys, and I was more on my mom's coattails. But as adults, we grew to really like and respect each other. And it was funny when he died. I was with him when he died. And it felt like these energetic lines of his control over me, of like him wishing me to be certain things, seemed to just disconnect. It's almost like the father in this reality had those energetic lines, and then something else was able to show up with that. And it's a very, very subtle sensation. However, it felt very real to me. Like I had a different freedom than I ever had before.
It's a gift you've given him in being awake to those subtle signs and in letting that relationship continue to unfold. People change. And I think when we die, we change a lot. Not that our personalities change, but because we have this increased perspective, because we can finally put our gifts to good use. We can finally put our wisdom to good use. And we can finally see that, maybe the child I didn't love that much when I was alive is exactly the child I need right now, but again, I hope I live my life seeing with the eyes of the dead and knowing that everyone I meet might have been my child in a past life. Everyone I meet might have been my mother in a past life.
That's a wonderful thought. And Robin Hart Shepherd has this wonderful question here. One of the things that mostly touched me in your book was that your children asked to have a funeral for the trees that were knocked down. Would you say something about that, please?
Yeah, that happened when the kids were little. A huge hurricane swept through the mountains. What hurricane was it? I'm trying to remember. Floyd, maybe. A mini tornado came down the mountain, and we lost 60 trees in our yard. And it was a terrifying night. We had the kids under the stairs, and huge white pines and old oaks were coming over. And my husband and I were saying every mantra and prayer we could think of to protect the house and, trying to keep the kids from being in a panic. But we made it through, and not a tree landed on the house, but there were so many trees down. It was astounding. It was 2 weeks before you could even get out on the road again. And I was so struck by, oh my goodness, I'm so glad we're okay. And I'm glad we're safe. And, how are we going to make a cup of coffee? And my daughter looked at me and said, my very, very wise daughter, my very wise children, said, Mommy, are the trees dead? And I said, not yet, but they will be in a few days. And it struck me then at that moment, with their roots all exposed and their root systems everywhere, that in fact the trees were dying all around us. And so we began to have a funeral service. That the rest of the day became not about managing the hurricane, but about being with the trees as they passed. And I am someone who, we all have deep connections with the non-human world, the more than human world, as David Abram would call it. For me, it's trees. And I often joke, I have a beloved friend, and she's a wonderful spiritual teacher who travels all over the world. I say she's a hummingbird and I'm an oak tree. I never go anywhere. I'm here. But I have a great affinity for trees. And those trees have been my great teacher, because when we lose our root systems is when we die. Mm. And we have to know what our root systems are. And we have to feel our root systems in the ground beneath us, embedding us in this earth in order to kind of call forth that life force of sap within us. And so a lot of my spiritual teaching have come from the trees, and specific trees who have been great, great teachers to me.
I can certainly relate. They do have a spirit way beyond, in different dimensions and realities, just like us.
Just like us. Just
We're
like us.
all functioning in there. Do you feel like, since you've stepped into this bigger interaction, that something bigger has shown up in you? That
my life has transformed since I started collaborating with the other side, with the dead, with the animals. And things that were really hard have become easier. Writing has become very easy for me. And my relationships with my family have really healed. It's possible to make miracles happen. And that's one of the things I teach people about. When you're hitting your head against the wall and you think you can't figure out a way of solution, that's the moment when we need, well, I call it other power, or a lower power, or a deeper power from the other side. And the dead have solved so many problems in my life. I begin every morning, Bart. My husband and I, our kids are grown. He makes the coffee in the morning because he's a morning person and I'm not. And we lie in bed drinking our coffee, watching the birds. And we fret because we are parents. So we fret about the kids, and we fret about the house, and we fret about the animals, and we fret about our health, and we fret about the state of the world. We fret about everything. And we turn over every worry to someone on the other side.
Wow.
And that's how we begin our morning with it. We have prayers that we do that sort of surround this and bookend this. But the heart of it is to say, we're not in charge. We're worried, but we're not in charge. And it's wonderful to feel the dead show up, and they really do.
Yes.
It's just magical. And that's why I call it magic, because it's ordinary, it's organic, but it's outside of our control.
It's the opposite of fear, because fear just gets a very linear point of view. And that's why, and anger can do this too, but particularly fear. And all you can see is that one thing, and you want to find a linear solution for it. Absolutely. And that creates such craziness. And you're talking about the exact opposite of that.
Well, and isn't that one of the things we're stuck with right now, that people seem to be getting so frightened? And there is a lot to be frightened of right now. The climate is changing in ways that are terrifying. Governments feel always terrifying. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're always terrifying.
They're always terrifying. But our medical system feels inadequate and terrifying, and our educational system feels inadequate and terrifying. And there's certainly a lot to be frightened of out there. But the antidote to fear is faith. And how do we cultivate faith within us? Because, like you said, the faith is what teaches us, I don't have to be in the driver's seat. I don't know how we're going to get there. I don't even really know where the road is. I really don't even know how to turn on the headlights, And how can I get in the back seat and enjoy the ride?
Mm.
And
And
that, and I kind of, I can remember as a small child loving that feeling. This was in the days before seat belts, remember? And you could lie down in the back seat and be driving somewhere, listening to my parents talk. They might have music on, and that feeling of being carried through the vehicle of the darkness. If we can
mm,
let ourselves be carried through the vehicle, be carried by the vehicle of the dad in our lives and enter that great river that holds us up and brings us to the sea, oh, we can exhale at last and have some
yes,
fun, have a good
it's
party.
it's like being in a big space of consciousness.
Yes.
And when you see somebody like the Dalai Lama, they're just this huge space that doesn't seem to have an beginning and end. And you just can you have so easily created a team that also contributes to your space.
Well,
And
I'm gonna post someone even more interesting than the Dalai Lama, because
okay,
I don't love religious authorities of any religion. So
all right,
I'm going to give you my grandmother, and she's
haha,
who I want to be, because here is this woman. She's a very ordinary woman. She, graduated high school. That was it. Got married, had 6 kids and 24 grandchildren, and figured out during the Depression how to feed them and keep them alive, right? How did she do it? She did it because she knew prayer works.
mm,
And my father would mock her for that. And I remember him once mocking her that, one of his sisters had pneumonia and she had 105 fever. And my grandmother made all the children sit around the bed saying the rosary all night long. And he said, oh my God, superstitious old nut. Well, that woman didn't have antibiotics. They weren't invented yet. She didn't have Tylenol. She didn't have Advil. She also didn't have any money for a doctor. And all she had was prayer. And the truth was that child got better. In fact, that child lived to be 96 years old. She only died this
wow,
past year. And all those kids lived to be in their 80s and 90s. And
mm,
that woman knew that prayer works. And you want to know something? My book got published yesterday. And Molly Finn, not the Dalai Lama, showed up in my dream. Molly Finn, this ordinary, from the mill towns in Massachusetts, in her polyester leisure suit, showed up in my dream. And she said to me, Perdita, I'm very proud of you. I'd like to take you out to buy a new outfit for your book. Oh, okay. And I said, and she took me shopping in my dream, and she started showing me the most god awful polyester leisure suits. And I said, well, I don't love these. And then she said, well, you're going to find something you love, and you know that I'm got it for you. And then she said, you got the message. I said, what was the message, Gammy? And she said, prayer works.
mm,
Well, I went yesterday after a big event. I snuck down to my favorite little clothing store to see if there was anything fun. And I walked into the dressing room. And in this dressing room in Woodstock, New York, at a clothing store, was a picture that my grandmother had in her living room of the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
wow,
And I knew she was there for me. And I knew that, what I would say to you is these old, overlooked, ordinary people, like you said, your redneck father and our rough and tumble frontier grandparents and our complicated, miserable ancestors, they have gifts to bring to us. All of them.
yes.
All of them. They do. They all want to take us out to get a nice new outfit.
And they're all intertwined with us like the mycelium network.
Exactly. And I think that's sort of like why people are taking mushrooms right now. I don't take psychedelics. My family says you must never take psychedelics. It would be too much for us.
Mm.
They all have. I don't.
Yeah.
But because if we get the message, and I don't think you need psychedelics to get this message. I say I can do it with the dead.
Hmm.
What we want to experience is the interconnectedness of all life,
Yes,
right? That's what makes us not afraid.
indeed.
And I think it is helpful. I think some people really do have that experience on their ayahuasca trip or their mushroom trip. But what we want to do is find a way to daily experience that and put it into action.
Yeah. And from what I see, because I hang with a kind of a young audience in Austin,
Uh-huh.
and they're doing all of this stuff, and they're in the common theme I'm really seeing a lot is I'm looking for myself. And, that's a very individual journey that we take with that of knowing ourselves. Which brings me to a quote. This comes from your book on page 181. I love this quote. One foot in the miraculous and one foot in the conventional. And more, I was losing my balance in both. When stepping into the mystic, for many, it is ecstatic, and yet it seems to be scary. What were your fears? Um, okay, so the quote I read was like losing my balance in the both, and then I added my comment because that was seemed to be so much of the journey as you were a very accomplished writer, very accomplished student. You were your father's girl, and all of these things, even though he was kind of not really seeing that in you because you
No.
were a hippie type, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, and yet you knew you were crossing over into something that scared you, but also magnified you to go right to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary to when I first, things when things really first, about it was 12 years ago when in my family, I mean, I write about this in Way of the Rose, and my husband writes about it in his book Waking Up to the Dark, and I write about it in Take Back the Magic. Our family kind of entered a crisis moment, and I mean, people have these initiations. I think the dead conspire to give them to us sometimes,
Mhm.
and they're not always fun. um, our daughter became very sick. She was really sick. The doctors couldn't tell us what was the matter, and it was terrifying. And my husband and I lost our freelance income. Those My Little Pony books vanished, and a lot of work dried up at this moment. And suddenly we found ourselves having spent all our money on our daughter's care and with no resources. And the only resource we had was prayer and the dead.
Mm,
And they started showing up, and they really showed up. And
wow.
and it was so unconventional. And I think a part of me has always wanted to be a good girl. I wanted to be a good girl and get my father's pat on the head, which I never did get, but when he was alive. And so I wanted to be normal. I I wanted to go to the swim meets and be a good mom and be on the PTA and vote in local elections and help get out the vote and be a good person. And meanwhile, stars are falling all around my house.
Yeah, yeah. It's so much like as I've read yours, and I've read Clark's book on the dark. I can't remember the name of it. It's
Waking up to the dark.
Waking Up to the Dark, and it's like you're both kind of being pushed into a beyond normal reality that's very mystical, and yet both of you seem not to be. That's not the direction that you sound like you thought you were going to be taking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anymore. Uh, uh, I don't. I think there was a moment when I think both my husband and I have validated each other in an unconventional life. And we've always made very unconventional choices. You said a hippie lifestyle, I live in Woodstock, New York. Um, certainly our family would not see us as conventional. But even inside the hippie environs of Woodstock, we, I think we're pretty unconventional at this point.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
But what you describe is so much beyond um, regular stuff. It's very exceptional.
well, I think it's available to everyone. And I don't think it was exceptional to our ancestors. And I think our ancient ancestors were in daily communication with the other side.
Yeah,
To circle back to the Cathars, and so many people these days are as interested in them, I think, as you and I are, and a lot of people are. There's that incredible moment, the last Cathars, they've been wiped out. And I mean, my God, the genocide was thorough.
thorough.
And the last 200 are up at, the siege of Montsegur, and they know they're going to die. And they were described walking those last 200 to the stakes where they were going to be burned alive, all singing together the Our Father in Latin. And that their faith, something about their joy and their faith triumphed over that moment of violence in such a way that it is spoken through the generations.
It is.
And
It is. And there's an energy at Montsegur today. It's really funny, where they were burned. Um, feels very light and expansive, but at the top, it feels like it doesn't. It's like constipated, where I think they shut the whole energy down. It's one of the most phenomenal experiences to see that duality with that. And it is so much about faith in this time, about creating that space that we can be much bigger. And I'm going to say my last promo for the show and what's for next week. And I want you to end, if there's some wisdom you'd like to impart with everybody, do you just give that a little bit of reflection while I tell everybody. This is Bart Sharp, and this is Becoming Quantum Conscious on United Public Radio and UFO Paranormal Radio on 107.7 and 105.3. We're also on Roku, Facebook, YouTube, and other platforms all around the world. And next week, we will have the Mycelium Revolution with Neil Doomra and Stephen Huntsman. And we're going to be going into a lot of the mystical health realities of the earth about what mushrooms are and that mycelium magic of what this is. So it will be a really entertaining hour. Neil's been on my show a couple of times. So please join us next week. And Perdita, are there any closing thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, one is that to put your own dead to the test. Pick one person from the other side and ask for their help. Ask for their help with something practical in your life. Maybe it's getting an actual human being on the phone when you have to make a phone call. Maybe it's actually with some paperwork. Maybe it's with some irritation in your life that you would like to ease through. Ask for help and see what happens. Because the more you experience how eager the dead are to help, the more real faith will grow in you. And then you too can become an oasis of faith for others in these times.
How wonderful. And wonderful to close this out with Perdita Finn, author, which was released yesterday, called Take Back the Magic, right there. But also she is the author of, along with her husband, Clark Strand, of The Way of the Rose, which explores a lot of what consciousness of the rosary is way beyond Catholicism. It goes into a very deep spiritual depth. Husband Clark Strand has written a wonderful book on taking back. No, not taking back. About
Waking Up to the
darkness.
Dark.
Waking Up to the Dark. Thank you. And your daughter Sophie Strand has just released a book on Mary Magdalene.
She did. It's called The Madonna Secret. And I don't know if you've read it, Bart, but
I
it is.
haven't.
Oh my gosh. It's a page turner. Mama's going to just put in a plug. That's the one, the most fun of all.
Okay. Well, she may have to come on the show if she's
Oh,
willing.
she'd love to be on the show.
Well, that'd be wonderful. I'm a big Magdalene fan, as I do Mary Magdalene French tours in Southwest France, and which we're doing tours in May of 2024. If you're interested,
I am interested.
yeah, it's a party. It's a spiritual party. It's an awakening party, and then we drink nice French wine and have good French food at the end. So, thank you so much, Perdita, for being on the show. It's been delightful, and I know lots of people are delighted with your presence here. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Bart. It has been an absolute delight. Thank you.
All right, so we're ending it here. Hope to see you next week on Becoming Quantum Conscious.